Good morning, team, and welcome. I want to thank you for taking the time this morning to join as we discuss the settlement and changes and just forging ahead together with confidence. I welcome you this morning along with my co-presenters, David Stribling and Tay Krull. This morning, we're each looking forward to sharing some information regarding the practice changes related to the NAR settlement effective August 17th. And I'm going to give you a little bit of high-level information on the changes and the spirit of the settlement. And then I'm going to hand it off to David and Tay, who are going to give you a little bit more detail around practical implementation in your day-to-day business. So how did we get here? There's been a lot of scrutiny the last several years on how real estate brokers are compensated and transparency on broker compensation. And this scrutiny, as it's evolved, has resulted in a multitude of lawsuits across our industry, just industry-wide, resulting in, as you likely know, multitude of judgments and then ultimately settlements. And those include Home Services of America's own settlement and the NAR settlement that has dictated the practice changes that we're talking about that are going to be implemented and effective on August 17th. So these industry practices are focused on consumer transparency. So just high level, and David's going to get into more detail on each of these. What are we going to see now? We're going to see that listing agreements are now only going to speak to the relationship and services between the listing broker and the seller that they are representing. And buyer representation agreements are, in the same fashion, only going to speak to the relationship and services between the selling broker and the buyer that they're representing. You've seen all these new forms. And in the buyer representation agreement, the buyers have agreed to compensate their broker, and the buyer and seller may now negotiate this compensation in the form of concessions through the purchase and sale agreement, which David is going to elaborate on. So some of these practice changes are some of the most, the outcomes that are impacted is the marketing and advertising. And one of the major ones that you're hearing about is that the offer of buyer agent compensation, the BAC, will no longer show on the MLS. And now we must have written authorization from our seller, and we're going to talk about how we're going to do that and what the mechanism is for it to advertise an offer of buyer agent compensation. This is going to be a company form because, as I indicated, this is not part of the listing agreement. And the question is, does this agreement bind the seller? No, this is going to be an agreement for you to be able to advertise that buyer agent compensation. But then any concessions by the seller are going to be negotiated between the buyer and the seller through the purchase and sale agreement. I know there's a lot of talk about how will we communicate the offer of the buyer agent compensation, the buyer agent commission, the BAC. And I think that's going to continue to evolve in practice and practical implementation, as you're conducting day-to-day business. But first off, remember that you must have consent from your seller in order to advertise or market the BAC anywhere outside of the MLS, and it will not reside in the MLS, and you cannot allude to any concession or any offer in the MLS. And this is something that we want to strictly adhere to. We are fortunate that the offer of BAC will appear, if your seller gives you permission, on our BHHS Northwest and BHHS Rep websites. And this is going to be, the mechanism is once you have that advertising form completed, that your office administrator is going to help you get that entered so that it appears on your websites. So it's very important that those documentation, not from just a compliance standpoint, but from a marketing standpoint, comes in a timely manner. Brokers are probably going to contact you directly. You may add a sign writer advertising at BAC, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And you may include the offer of BAC in your marketing, flyers, social media, and any other non-MLS advertising. But one thing I want to talk about is there are some pitfalls because we have some habits we have to break. We have some practices that we are used to and accustomed to. And we need to make sure that we are adhering to the spirit of the settlement. So we do have some marketing and advertising don'ts. And I want to talk about these today a little bit because I've seen just industry-wide through social media, there might be some maybe not full understanding of the rules and what we can and how we can and can't portray the offer of compensation. So if you're representing a seller or if you're marketing, be very, very careful. Make sure you do not state, market, or advertise that all of my sellers will offer 3% or all of my sellers are going to offer 2.5%. I only, my sellers are guaranteed to offer X percentage, or all of my sellers will offer a BAC. And you also have to make sure you don't state, market, or advertise, I will offer 3%, or I will offer 2.5%, or I will offer a BAC on all of my listings. Because we have to remember the very core of this is the spirit of the terms of the settlement are first and foremost that this is a negotiation between the buyer and the seller, and that each party is responsible for the compensation to their agent. So there is no co-broker compensation. You don't actually have anything to offer because these are two separate, these compensations are decoupled from each other. And we also can't speak to what our sellers will do because ultimately it's a negotiation through each transaction is going to be an individual negotiation. Now, you may choose who you work with, but you have to make sure that you don't characterize that in your advertising, right? So you need to be very careful in your advertising that it is adhering to the spirit of the settlement. Ultimately, there is continued scrutiny on our industry around practices. And so we want to make sure that we are upholding our end of it. And we do believe that a transparent process is going to benefit the consumer and be a benefit to all of us through the transaction process. And then make sure when you're representing a buyer that brokers must not filter out or restrict listings displayed to consumers based on the level of compensation being offered. So that's something that we have to be very careful of also. I'm now going to hand it off to David, who is going to give you a little bit more information on practical day-to-day implementation of these practical rules and the forms in your day-to-day business.
Thanks, Melanie. So buyer's representation agreements, these are required for us starting August 17th. But if you remember in Oregon, we've got a law that's coming up into effect on January 1st that will require this also. So it's probably a good idea to start following the law and the rules there immediately. We have two different providers for these forms. We have ORF and we have Oregon Realtors. And with those different forms, there's three levels of service. There's exclusive, meaning the buyer can only work with you. There's non-exclusive, meaning they can sign it with multiple parties. And then there's a non-agency agreement. We're not mandating which form you use, but our preferred form is Oregon Realtor form. It's exclusive, it is concise and clear, but mostly it is easier for the client, the public, to understand. I would caution you, if you do use the ORF form, please don't use the non-agency form because until that is sorted out in court, I don't want to be us sorting it out. So if you do use an Oregon Realtors buyer representation agreement, you can still use the ORF purchase and sale agreement. I know we've said before, don't mix any of that, but these are two separate contracts, so it's okay in this. And lastly, I want to make sure that you remember that Oregon agency regulations are still in effect. Disclosed limited agencies, the Oregon brochure, all of those have to be given to buyers. One of the things that I always like to remember is agency and compensation are two different things. Agency is created by your actions, and you can be held liable for that. Compensation is only created now by a contract. So not only do we have differences there, but when do you have to do it? So what the agreement says is there's two times: working with a buyer and touring a home. So what's working with a buyer? That's basically anything that's defined in ORS 696 as real estate activity, identifying potential properties, arranging property tours, negotiating on behalf of our buyers, and preparing and presenting offers. Anytime you do that, or I should say, prior to doing any of those activities, that's when you need the buyer agreement. And touring a home, those must be signed prior to viewing a home with a client. Non-represented buyers also. If you notice that last slide, I said there was a non-represented buyer agreement. They must sign. We get the question of what about open houses? You're working on behalf of the seller, so you don't have to get it signed for an open house. But if you leave that open house and go see another one, you have to get that signed. So when it comes with listings, the number one thing that we need to realize out of this settlement is the decoupling. Nowhere in the listing agreement are we offering co-op compensation. For lack of a better term, co-op compensation is dead. The only way a buyer is going to get paid is through a buyer's agency agreement. So in the effort to promote consistency and ensure compliance with all of these rules, we're consolidating the number of listing agreements that we have. If you are part of RMLS, continue to do things the way you have. Use their exclusive listing agreement going forward. If you're one of the other MLSs that have the variety of different listing agreements, please use the Oregon Realtor exclusive listing agreement. As I said, these will help us be consistent and make sure that we're complying with all the regulations. You can use the input sheets from the MLSs that you have normally been using, just don't use their form if you're WVMLS or one of the other ones. Again, I want to caution you, remember, buyer's agent compensation cannot be contained in that listing agreement anywhere. Don't put it in additional provisions, just don't add it. And I've been online too. Code words aren't going to work. Don't use code words in there to indicate that the buyer's agent commission will be paid or compensation will be paid by the seller. So how do we do that? How do we say how the listing agent or how the seller would compensate a buyer's agent? And so we have a new form, the advertising authorization of buyer's agent compensation. And if you notice that this is not a contract, this is an authorization. It allows you to advertise that the seller paid, that the seller is paying a buyer agent compensation. To be binding, compensation will need to be addressed in the sale agreement. The amount is negotiable, and you can see a theme here that across everything is that these things are negotiable. That's the suit. This must be signed even for a seller that opts out. And when you get it and you read it, you'll see that it says that the seller is considering it. It doesn't bind them to do it. If they get a low offer, they could change their mind. So this just allows us to advertise it in the sources that Melanie talked about. So what about my existing listings? What do I do now? Well, if you have existing listings, we are required to disclose 3 different things on August 17th. Number one, that these fees are not set by law. Compensation is not set by law. Compensation is fully negotiable. And lastly, that after August 17th, there will be no buyer's agent commission on MLS. Most of us have signed MLS agreements that says we're going to offer that. So you need to modify it. Most all of our MLSs have a form that takes care of that. There are two MLSs that do not, WVMLS and Tillamook. If you belong to either of one of those, instead of using this listing contract addendum like you would in RMLS or the different MLSs, Oregon Coast MLS, Central Oregon MLS, they all have a form. Please use that one. In WVMLS and Tillamook, use the listing contract, or excuse me, use the advertising authorization of buyer agent commission. That will give you the ability to continue to advertise that the seller will consider paying a buyer's agent. And then lastly, as I said, we're consolidating and creating an environment that we hope complies with the spirit and the legalities of this agreement. For a long time, for listings, we have had clauses in listings and sale agreements that talk about mediation arbitration. What we are doing is pulling that out, making sure that all of the language complies and that is consistent across all of our enterprise. So there is one that's representing a buyer. So you have the buyer sign this when they sign the buyer representation agreement. Mainly what this does is confirms that any disputes with the clients will be settled with mediation arbitration. I'm sure you guys know how to explain this. You explained it before. You get it on listings and sale agreements. When you're representing a seller, it's kind of belt and suspenders, but you know how attorneys are. So this has to be signed with the listing agreement. It confirms again that any disputes with clients will be settled with the mediation arbitration process. But the seller mediation arbitration also references that RMLS listing agreement and the Oregon Realtor agreement that we ask you to sign. So, there's a few new forms here that we're going to have. They're going to be on SkySlope in my office. I know this is a lot of change is coming towards us, but the number one thing that I would say, it's going to be okay. We're going to go through this. My main advice to you is just to take care of business. Continue to be the exceptional professionals that you are and provide that expert service that you always have. If you have questions, as Melanie said, your office leaders will be there available to help, and we'll get through this all together. So Tay, you have some information for us too.
I do. I've got a few slides here to go through, and then we'll be wrapping this up. I want to touch on the fact that we've had a lot of great opportunity in Washington to already experience a lot of this. So those of you that are watching from the Vancouver offices, you know that the buyer broker service agreement in Washington or the buyer representation agreement in Oregon is really not a difficult form to be signed. This went into law in Washington at the first of the year, January 1st. So we've had 7 months and 7 days of experience working with these agreements and really have found very little to no kickback or issues that have come from it. It really has not been an issue. And one of the big reasons is because now it's a statewide requirement. And so you as brokers get to say, hey, this is just part of the process. And this is good for buyers and good for brokers, just as I have there on the slide. Now, with that, I want to make sure that we remember you're going to get this beaten into you. Your buyer representation agreements have to be signed before you show properties. They also need to be turned in right after they're signed, just like any other signed part of your contract. So you'll send those through SkySlope when you get a buyer service agreement or buyer representation agreement signed. You'll send those through SkySlope and we'll hold those in your file until you have a completed contract or agreed upon contract. Okay. Now, with all of that, we want to make sure that when we're talking to our buyers about these new representation agreements, that we're coming from a space of having good, positive energy and being excited about it. It is a benefit for the buyers to have transparency. And so below, you can take a screenshot, or this will be made available to your managers and they can share it with you, but just a short script on how you can kind of come with a good, positive space when it comes to talking about these new agreements with your buyers. And I'll read it. Recently, the industry has undergone some great changes, bringing more transparency, where now buyers receive the benefits of an agency agreement before they ever even step into a home. This ensures you know exactly the professional relationship between us on day one. This is such a great change for the industry. From there, you have them sign the contract and you move on to showing homes, representing them by negotiating and closing transactions like you always have. Again, Washington for 7 months has had relatively no issues, no concerns, no problems with this. And so that's the good news. We have kind of 7 months of experience. So those of you in Oregon that are just going to start this, rest assured this is not a difficult process. It's very, very simple. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. We'll talk a little bit about a new company policy. So when there's changes, of course, there's opportunity to create new policies. And this will impact some of us, and for some of us, it won't. What I have found by talking to your leaders across Oregon and in Vancouver is that the demands or requests that we send to escrow for the BAC is termed differently in our different regions. So I want to make sure we all know and understand what we're talking about. They're listed there. There's 6 of them throughout Oregon and Vancouver. Commission demand, or CD, broker demand, compensation demand, escrow instructions, broker instructions to escrow, and in zip forms, it's called notices and instructions to escrow. You should notice or be familiar with at least one of those terms. For most of our agents, the company has always sent these demands or requests to escrow on your behalf. However, we have found that there are a good number of agents that do this on their own behalf. And so we want to make sure that going forward, starting today, we no longer do that as an agent directly to escrow. The company will handle that for you going forward. So rest assured, it's something easier for you. You won't have to process it. If you've always let the company do that, if we've always done it for you, great, nothing will change. Now, the reason for that is because, as you have heard, for us to receive commission from escrow on your behalf on a buy side, we have to have your buyer broker service agreement in Washington or your buyer representation agreement in Oregon in the file already. We cannot receive funds from escrow without that money, without that already in the file. So this is our mechanism to make sure that we're staying compliant and not asking for money that we don't legally have the right to get. So again, remember, get it signed before you show the first property, turn it in right away, and we'll have no problem with that process. 7 months of doing this in Washington, and no buyer agent has gone without getting their paycheck. Okay, so this is, it's not an issue. It becomes a priority for everybody in the transaction to make sure that we have these things in the file so that we can make those orders. But remember too, if you don't turn one in and we do close the transaction, or the transaction closes, you're not entitled to any commission. And we want to make darn sure that no one experiences that. So be sure to get your buyer representation agreements and your buyer broker service agreements in Washington turned in on time. Last thing that I will note is that we are seeing in Washington, in the audits, they are being very, very strict about this. They're looking for it actively as it's something new, and they want to make sure that everybody is in compliance. So remember, fines and potential licensing issues could occur if you're turning in buyer representation agreements that you had signed on the day you made the offer for the property. They're going to want proof that that was really also the day that you first met the client and you hadn't shown them houses before. Or if you're getting them signed after you're under mutual, those are going to be potential issues for the DOL. Well, for sure there'll be issues for the DOL. All right, let's go to the next slide. We've got 2 more, same things. This brings us to the opportunity to do some new marketing for y'all. So marketing team has put together some options and sent to your local sign companies of sign writers that you can order for yourself. So if you're a seller is offering some type of buyer broker compensation or buyer compensation, let's go to the next page. We'll show some more offers here. In any way, you can order these signs, sign writers, to put on your yard arms. So these options, you can see some have a QR code where you can direct consumers to your website. So that's great if you want to do that. These are all options for the sellers. You'll want to make sure that the seller wants to market it in front of their property and that it's marketed appropriately. Also, you'll notice at the bottom of that slide, it says white and Cabernet options are available also. So if you've got, if you want to utilize those colors, you can. And if there's anything that you're not seeing in these two slides that you'd like to have, and you feel like, hey, this would be a great one, another option for a sign writer, just let your office leader know, and they can connect with us, and we can see about getting more options available to you. We're not limited to the number of options, but these are available effective immediately. You can call any of your sign companies today and make these orders. They are ready to go. I'm told that all but one sign company has these also displayed on their website. So I think for the most of you, you'll be able to go on the websites and see these visually, but if not, you will at least be able to call. They have these ready and able to go for you. So order these up if you'd like to market in that way. And for that, I'm done. I'll hand it off to Melanie to bring us home. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Tay. And we made it in just under 30 minutes, so we hit our target. I just want to remind you all, as we fulfill our commitment to provide a transparent and exceptional experience to our consumers, that your sales leaders are well prepared to be partners with you in this. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out, and they will be an amazing resource for you. And ultimately, we'll work together to make sure that you are the best prepared agents to navigate this market ahead. So have a great day, and you'll be hearing more from your leaders relevant to forums and things like that. And we will hope to see you each soon.